have a very special guest all the way from the San Francisco Bay Area of California. I will introduce our guest shortly, but just a few reminders before we get started. We are live on Zoom and live streaming to YouTube. And if you're seeing us on YouTube and you're in Central Florida, be sure to join us on Meetup if you haven't already. That way you can keep up with all of our activities, since not all of them are on Facebook or YouTube. As you well know, evolution is true. So the novel coronavirus has mutated into something more powerful. And I'm sad to say it's going to keep us from being able to have the in-person event next month we had planned. Instead, we are going to be hosting our longtime friend and now NASA contractor, Dr. Daniel Batchelder, for our September 19th event. That will be at 1 p.m., not 3 like today, but 1 p.m. right here on Zoom. Dan has promised to join us when we do get back to in-person events. So for now, we'll continue our large educational events online like this one, because we want to follow the best practices as we're seeing regarding the coronavirus. Just a few quick reminders. Be sure you are with us on Meetup so you'll get the email alerts of all of our events. You can sign up for that at meetup.com/CFL Freethought. And once you join, be sure to RSVP for upcoming events and put them on your calendar, of course. If you want to hear about our events via the old way, which is email, go to tinyurl.com/CFFC newsletter. Give us your email address and any other contact information that you like, and we'll promise to keep you in the loop. Pretty much it's a once a month email, so it's not a huge amount of email you're getting from us. Today's event is part of our reoccurring educational series, and you can find all of our past presentations from many amazing speakers from all around the country on YouTube at youtube.com/CFL Freethought. And of course, just to finish this all up, if you're following us on Facebook, that's great. But if not, you can find us at facebook.com/CFL Freethought. Okay, so if you're with us in the Zoom meeting today, this is just a little bit of housekeeping. You can find the chat option available at the bottom of your screen on your computer. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the screen and it should appear as an option. And chat is where we want you to ask questions today. So put those there and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. Also, your microphone is going to be kept on mute so you don't accidentally interrupt the presentation. If you want to keep your camera on, absolutely fine, go for it, but please avoid any visual distractions. And I'll leave that to your imagination to think about what that might be, but please avoid it. Okay. Following the death of her infant son in 2009, Rebecca Hensler discovered that as an atheist, she felt alienated and isolated by mainstream grief support. After being told too many times that her son was in heaven, she realized that non-believers deserve grief support that is both compassionate and rational. That support system simply wasn't available in 2011, so she founded Grief Beyond Belief. It's an online, secular, peer-to-peer support community specifically for those grieving without faith. Since then, the community has grown into thousands, and her work has expanded to providing secular grief support workshops and writing the Secular Grief Support Handbook to teach others how to provide support to grieving non-believers in their communities. Today's talk is also a product of that work, and we are so glad to have her with us. She currently lives with her wife in the Bay Area and works as a school counselor. Welcome to the CFFC, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me as a speaker today. I really, really love the opportunities I have to speak to people around the country, and while I miss the experience, obviously, of being, flown to Minneapolis and Baltimore and all these places I'd never gotten to see before, I really do appreciate how technology has made it possible for me to speak to people around the country virtually. And particularly this year when there's so much need for grief support. I usually begin by telling a little bit of my story. because the story of grief beyond belief really starts with my son Jude. Um, Up until my 40th year, I had had a substantial amount of experience with grief because when I was in my 20s as a member of the queer community, obviously I knew many, many people who were living with AIDS and HIV, and lost many, many friends. And back at that time, as an AIDS activist, we were very good at taking our grief and turning it into action to make a difference. And so that's really where I learned that lesson that when you're grieving, sometimes it helps to do something that makes a difference. Um, but it wasn't until when I was in my 40s that I really experienced um, the kind of grief that led to me founding Grief Beyond Belief. I had been told I would never be able to get pregnant, well, unless I could spend $80,000 on fertility treatments. And so I was really delighted when I actually was able to get pregnant with my son, Jude. Um, it's funny, people who are believers would have called it a miracle. I was just very happy and felt very lucky. Um, but sadly, quite soon after we learned that I was pregnant, we learned that Jude was developing in utero with a condition called congenital diaphragmatic hernia, which is a hole in the muscle that holds the organs, the chest organs in the chest cavity, and the abdominal organs in the abdominal cavity. And what happens to babies who are developing with this condition is that their abdominal organs can migrate up into the chest area and will cause deformations and small size of lung and heart development. And so we knew that Jude was going to be very sick when he was born. But we also knew that thanks to my union, I had really good health care and we could give him the absolute best chance possible. So Jude was born on June 9th in 2009, and he was beautiful and sweet and kind of funny and cranky. He was very affectionate to the degree that a baby who spends pretty much his entire life in a ICU bed can show affection, which was mostly just grabbing our fingers all the time. Um, and, he was a quirky little guy with a lot of personality for being so tiny. And we felt very lucky to have the time we did with him. He got very good medical care, and he fought really hard. But um, 90 days after he was born, he died in my arms. His lungs had not been able to develop enough to support his growing body. And um, the early days of grief are a bit of a blur. Um, it's those of you who've been through a loss like that probably know that it's just a very strange time with your brain doing very strange things to just kind of keep you going. Um, I was obviously immensely sad. And I sought grief support over the year that after he died in multiple ways. But one thing I discovered was that there was this thing called online grief support. Um, and I connected with an organization called the Compassionate Friends, which is a 60-year-old international organization of grieving parents and siblings and grandparents. And it was amazing because online grief support means that if you're falling apart in the middle of the night, you can reach out to people at 1 in the morning, and there's someone there who's been through something similar to what you've been through. But it also very quickly, started showing me that the way I was grieving as a non-believer was substantially different from the way people who were believers grieved. Because so much of the support that was offered was based on the idea that someday we would be with our children again, that our children were there all around us, that our children could send us signs. And so all these things that were supposed to be comforts, all they did for me was cause a great deal of cognitive dissonance, because even if I kind of like tried to, oh, okay, well, this person's telling me that he's in heaven and they mean it well, so I'm trying to, just kind of go with the flow. I would get all these thoughts in my head like, okay, he's in heaven. Well, he's a baby. Who's taking care of him in heaven? Would he grow up in heaven? Would he go to school in heaven? I mean, for me, it just, I, it wasn't working. I knew people were trying to be kind, and I couldn't offer what they wanted either, because people would post things like, and this was on a Facebook page, and people would post things like, "Oh, I saw a butterfly on my car today, and I know it's a sign from my son who died because he liked butterflies. And don't you all think it's a sign? Don't you think it's him trying to tell me something?" And everyone would be saying yes, 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 and I would have in my head, like, if you'd seen a bird, you'd think that was a sign too. Like anything, that's what our brains do. We're pattern matching people. And so I was very quickly discovering that both in terms of what I had to offer and what I was receiving, it wasn't working for me because my beliefs were so different. But I was also really in the depths of grief at this point. It was just a few months after my son had died. Um, and so it was more a sense of this wasn't working for me. Um, and I could see there were a few other people. I met a man named Cliff Schrager, who was also part of the group. He had had two teenage sons die in a terrible car accident, and he was a former evangelical pastor in Michigan, and he had lost his faith. And through him, I learned that if you had been a believer and you were surrounded by believers, this experience of grieving without a faith belief was 10 times worse, because you were under so much pressure to maintain your faith. And I saw, people say things to him on his Facebook page that were just sort of shocking to me. Say to him things like, "Oh, God took your sons because he did not want them to witness their father's apostasy." So to me, I was learning very quickly how big their need there was. And there were a lot of atheists at the time who were writing about the lack of grief support for grieving non-believers. And honestly, I'm not gonna lie, I spent a year hoping that someone else would kind of fill that gap. And no one did. And I'm the kind of person who eventually is like, well, I'm just going to do it myself. And so I started figuring out how to start an organization to provide grief support online for grieving nonbelievers, and what kind of rules we would need and what kind of platform I wanted to use. And so about 2 years after Jude died, in 2011, I launched a Facebook page called Grief Beyond Belief. Um, and a whole bunch of atheist and humanist bloggers did this amazing job of getting the word out. But honestly, I seriously thought, like, I'm gonna start this page and, a dozen people will join. Um, and, so here it's me and my Facebook page, and it'll just be a few people, and we'll all be able to talk about our grief. Um, I think the first day about 100 people joined. By the end of the first week, 1,000 people had joined. But more important than the numbers was that from the first hours of the existence of Grief Beyond Belief, people were posting about their grief, about what it was like for them grieving without belief in any kind of afterlife. Um, and other people were posting back with support, with, I've gone through that too. Here's how I handled it. I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. Grief sucks, which is really often what you want to hear when you're grieving, is just acknowledgement that the whole thing sucks. Um, People were sharing things that they'd found comforting. Um, every day, one day it would be, we're all posting pictures of our memorial tattoos. And the next day it would be, here are the songs that are reminding me of my loved one who died. And it was just an incredible community. And it grew and grew and grew. Um, and it wasn't easy. It especially wasn't easy. A couple years later, when a evangelical decided that he was going to somehow convert people by posting like brimstone and hellfire posts on a grief support page. And and myself and a woman who from Australia who was volunteering to help me had to, protect the page from constantly being spammed with evangelical posts. Um, and it wasn't easy because Facebook isn't easy, and Facebook kept changing the features and changing the privacy. And so eventually what we did was started a Facebook group, which is closed. It's closed in that you have to ask to join. It's open for people to join, but you have to request to join, and we have a process for adding members. And that's been the place where most people who are part of the community are receiving support. Um, and I also started having a lot of opportunities to talk to people around the country and at conferences and tell them about the community. Um, and that's been an extraordinary experience in itself for a couple reasons. One is it's just been amazing to meet people. And, it's a little strange to have people come up to me in the hallways of conferences and say, "Oh, you're the grief lady," and start telling me about their loved one who died recently. Um, and as my wife says, I'm famous for being sad, which is a pretty strange experience to have what people know of you be the loss you've experienced and what you did in response. Um, but one of the other things that happened is that this idea I had about rational compassion, that it was possible to support each other through painful and challenging experiences without um, without myths and without wishful thinking. It was possible to provide compassionate care for each other um, that was still rational, kind of spread. So when I started Grief Beyond Belief, it was pretty much the only secular support group um, on the Facebook platform, and really it was, and on much of the internet alone, itself. Um, Very quickly, people started saying, well, if you can do grief support without God or spiritualism, we can do other kinds of support. So very quickly, people started secular cancer survivor groups and secular mental health, secular support for people who are experiencing mental health problems. When I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, I went on Facebook and searched for, secular MS, and all these things are available now. And it's really, I think, the way I think about it is it kind of created another branch of the secular community. And, while were activists, obviously, there were community groups like, Sunday assemblies and humanist and ethical societies. Um, and obviously, there were all the creative types, the bloggers and the artists and the musicians. Um, it really created this other arm of the secular community that I think of as the secular support community, that I think was kind of the missing piece. And I feel really good about the role that I played in starting that. I think, one of the things that I still hear that to me is just a myth is this idea that um, without a belief in an afterlife, without a belief in a higher power, there really is no comfort when it comes to losing a loved one. Um, and we haven't found that true at all in the Grief Beyond Belief community. We really um, had a you know, a learning curve, and we learned from each other what really helped. And so, one of the things I definitely want to talk about is what are the things we learned help when people are grieving. Um, One thing was just that without a belief in the supernatural, a lot of us really struggled with the strange things our brains were doing when we were grieving. We struggled with, I keep thinking I'm seeing my loved one. Um, or that pattern matching of like thinking you see things that are signs, the dreams that people have. And so we were able to teach each other how common these things are and that these are ways that our brain protects us. And in fact, it's really interesting. Grief hallucinations. I mean, Oliver Sacks, who himself was a non-believer, writes a whole chapter in his books hallucinations about grief hallucinations, and they're very common. And it really helps to understand, like, you're not, going crazy. And also, it's not that you're actually seeing a ghost. This is your brain will, while grieving, um, essentially interpret pretty much anything that resembles your loved one as your loved one. Um, we also just learned a lot about reassuring each other that the weird things you do when you're grieving are normal and typical and healthy. So, the fact that you can't throw away certain things. I mean, I still, in my closet, have the toothbrush and hairbrush that I was given for my son. He never used them, but I also can't seem to throw them away. And for a while there, I was feeling like, what's wrong with me that I can't do this the rational thing of getting rid of this. And hearing from other people all the things that they couldn't throw away was like, oh, okay, this is a thing. This is a thing we do when we're grieving. Um, the things we do to avoid the triggers, the way that grief comes in waves. We really learned from each other in the Grief Beyond Belief community. The other thing we do that's really comforting is storytelling. And that is such an important part of grieving, being able and of supporting people in grieving. So, listening to other people's stories about their loved ones, asking for stories. And if you also knew the person that someone is grieving for, telling the grieving person stories that they don't know is actually this huge gift, because you're kind of giving them a little piece of the person they're missing that they didn't know before. Um, we also just learned that a lot of the things that religious communities in churches and synagogues do to support their grieving members do not need religion to do them. That it helps, of course, to bring food for someone. We learned that, people didn't like it when they're told by someone who's trying to be sympathetic, oh, let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Well, when you're in a real crisis of grief, the idea of coming up with something someone could do to help and asking them for it is itself often too much. And so just having someone say, like, I'd like to come by and pick up your laundry and do it for you, and I'll just bring it back. That's a much more helpful offer. Or if someone is, that someone in your community is grieving for their wife who was always in charge of all the car maintenance, saying, like, would you like me to come by and pick up your car and, take it in for its tune up? Or anything that really is a concrete offer of help, many people find much more helpful than the vague, just let me know if there's anything I can do. So we really, it was an education for me and our whole community. Um, because the thing about grieving without faith is this. And I kind of think of it this way. This is my metaphor for it. Like, you're walking along through life and someone you love dies, and this kind of chasm opens up below your feet. And for a little bit there, you're Wile Coyote pedaling your feet, and then you fall, because that's what happens when you're grieving. Now, people who have faith beliefs, and particularly people who have belief in some kind of afterlife that will allow for them to be with the person in the future, it's like there's this rope there they grab onto while they're falling. It's not that they don't fall into grief. It's that they don't fall all the way, that there's something they can hold on to that keeps them from hitting the bottom. And that's what we don't have. And in fact, if someone starts the grieving process with a faith belief and loses their faith, in some ways that's even harder because they lose that rope. But we fall all the way to the bottom of that pit, and then we're there. Um, and the thing about peer to peer grief support is we're not there in that pit alone. We're there in that pit with other people. And the thing about forming a community that stays with each other in this process is that there's this kind of ramp we show each other to climb. It's not easy. It's that we kind of show each other how to live with grief so that we can keep walking forward. Um, and so we help each other not move on or find closure, but we do help each other learn to live with our grief. And I think that that's a really powerful part of the rational compassion that we share. This year has obviously been particularly hard for people in terms of grief. Um, and it's not just because of the quantity of losses, it's also the nature of those losses. There's so many things that have been different this year, from, not being able to be with loved ones in the hospital when they were dying, to not being able to come together in person with other people who are grieving. Um, it's the isolation people experience when they're grieving. Um, it's been not being able to do the healthy things people do. Um, because, when you're grieving, it's not just a matter of processing your grief. People who are grieving also need things to distract them. That's a healthy thing to do when you're grieving, is to be distracted. But if you can't go to the gym, and you can't go out to restaurants, and you can't take that trip somewhere that might, help you through that time, um, it's even harder. And so, what I'm talking about here about this year is that it's not just grief, it's trauma. And it's this collective trauma that, thousands and thousands, millions of people have experienced this year, that we're all trying to figure out how to get through together. Um, And again, we're all just learning at this point. So, um, that's pretty much the story of grief beyond belief. I do want to take some time now, um, because I know that in among the people who are here, there, whether or not you're ready to talk about it, there are people who are dying. I mean, there are people who are grieving, who have had loved ones who've died. Um, and and so I want to take a minute to spend with that grief. Um, Even though we are isolated, I know that most of us have someone on our mind who we've lost this year, or in recent years. And so I want to take a minute and do a little bit of ritual, because that's something else that we've learned, is that um, just because we are not religious, just because our rituals don't involve a faith belief, doesn't mean that ritual isn't helpful. And so I'm going to ask you all to just take a minute. You can close your eyes if you'd like to close your eyes. You can leave your eyes open. Start by just taking a few deep breaths. Take a breath in and a breath out, and another breath in and a slow breath out. And I'm going to ask you to think of someone who you are missing, someone who has died, or even someone who you've been isolated from in the past year. One of the things about our brains is that we hold a multitude within them. Everyone we've known exists in our minds. And so I'm inviting you to bring someone you love who you're missing, someone who's died or someone who you haven't been able to be with, to the forefront of your mind and picture that person. Picture them smiling. Picture them serious or worried. Picture them laughing or making a funny face that they would make. Just take a moment and be with that person and their expression in your own mind. And think of something they said to you or something they taught you. One of the things about the people we lose is that we learn something from them while they were there. Just think of that thing that they said or the thing you learned from them, something they said or did that made you feel good when you were sad or made you laugh when you were happy. And in your mind, just take a moment to thank them. If this person's died, they can't hear you. We know that. But the person in your mind, you can still say thank you to. You can still let your image of them in your mind know you're grateful for them taking up residence there. And after you've thanked them, in your mind, you can give them a big hug or a firm handshake or a high five. And let the image go for now because it's going to be there in your brain. For as long as you've got a functioning brain, they're there with you in there. Take one more deep breath and breathe out. And come back into this space that you're in now. One of the things that so many non-believers find most comforting is this. And I call it the ripple effect. If you love someone and if they had an important place in your life, they change something about who you are and what you do. They taught you something. They taught you a recipe. They taught you how to say a word in another language. They gave you useful advice. But there is something that you learned from them or something that they did that you do now. And when you do that thing, or you teach someone else what they taught you, that person who you have taught or you have impacted with your actions will go on to have impact on other people. And they will be able to live on. The person you've lost will be able to live on in the impact you have on other people because of them, and those people have on other people because of you. These are the ripple effects. And for me, grief beyond belief is one of Jude's ripple effects. My son was a tiny little guy. And he only lived 90 days. And most people would say, a tiny little baby who only lived 90 days, well, that had a lot of effect on his family, but not a lot of effect on the world. But Grief Beyond Belief now has thousands of members all around the world who would not be receiving support that is appropriate for them and meets their needs um, if Jude hadn't existed. And so to me, it helps me live without my son. Um, and I hope that hearing the story of how this tiny little baby managed to have a big impact on the world helps other people live with their own grief. And I would like to be able to answer your questions now if people have questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for sharing with us. I do have some questions. I appreciate you bringing your story and sharing your story with us. I think it's important. I agree that the storytelling is so incredibly valuable as we have these conversations. One of the questions that has come up is, and I'm going to read it here. People are continuing to die of COVID. Survivors have not yet had responses from Washington. COVID grief is different. There are constant triggers, and for some, it's created a form of PTSD. What can you share to support those that have lost someone to COVID, and how to offer support to secular friends who've lost someone?
Oh, such a big question. I think, as a counselor, to me, part of what we need to do is acknowledge that this isn't just grief, this is trauma. And I'm really glad that you named that by saying, that COVID has resulted in PTSD. And part of what happens is for people who have lost someone to COVID, it's not like you can take a break from it at this point, right? It's not like you can say, I'm going to focus on something else and, not be exposed to people talking about COVID. Um, and so we just have to really acknowledge that that's a very hard place to be. In the world of counseling and psychology, we have a term called adverse childhood experiences. And part of what's happened this year is that every child has experienced an adverse childhood experience, and that's going to be impacting them for decades. And so the question of, how do you provide support? I think we need to just remember what we already know about grief support, that people need to be heard more than anything else. And that what we can do is give people places and time to talk or to not talk as they need. And, you know, as we move forward, find ways in which people, I think this is one of the hardest things, is one of the things that is helpful in grieving is meaning making. And so with COVID, that's so hard because a lot of what we've experienced at this point, people are angry and hurt. Um, and, especially in the last couple of months, many of us are feeling like many of these deaths are unnecessary and could have been avoided. And so it's harder to make meaning in a situation like that. Um, and I sincerely hope and sincerely believe, especially having been through the AIDS epidemic myself and, being familiar with what it's like to feel that sense of your loss being unjust. And yet, even so, during the AIDS epidemic, we figured out how to make art and how to make a difference and how to come together and in anger and humor and love. Um, and so I have to believe that that's possible, and that we will find ways to do that. I This is a hard question because I don't think I have easy answers. I just trust that the part of me that is humanist trusts that we will find a way. Um, I had a student about a decade ago, and she was talking about her family's beliefs, and she said her family didn't believe in God. And then she said, we like to make our own miracles. And to me, that's my definition of humanism is we make our own miracles. And so as desperate as this situation is, I do have faith that we as humans will make our own miracles and find ways to come together to support each other.
Well, that actually works really well with another question we received. And I'm just going to read this here. Part of grief in the COVID era is one of assigning blame to the past and present political leaders for their failures and seeming lack of support for public health initiatives. What do we do with those thoughts that we have that would be healthy or potentially constructive? How do we constructively respond to this?
Um, that is a question that is quite dear to my heart as an AIDS activist, because I think the answer is take action, and that can take whatever form you are comfortable with. We are, the thing about making change is that it's not like everyone has to do the same thing. And in fact, real change only happens when we're coming at it from these different directions. So if what your thing is writing, whether it's writing a letter to the editor, writing a letter to politicians, writing a blog, if you make videos, all of that content that we can share with each other, but also, if your thing is going to a political protest, then, you can find a way to do that. If your thing is voting, if your thing is campaigning for a a politician who you think would do the right thing. I mean, to me, especially as an AIDS activist, I've been a supporter of single payer healthcare for my entire adult life. And to me, a big part of this is like, we need to make sure that this thing happens. And you might disagree with me. I'm not saying that, I have the right answer. I'm saying that I think whatever way you feel comfortable taking action, and during the AIDS epidemic, for many people, creating memorials like the AIDS Memorial Quilt, um, or just caretaking and volunteering. People found a way to transform their pain into action, um, in a terribly desperate time. And I feel like if there's anything we as AIDS activists and survivors of that pandemic have to offer, it's that we demonstrated that that's possible. And please don't forget that part of why, um, the treatments and vaccinations came into being so quickly this past year, was because we protested for that during the AIDS epidemic, when we were able to see that sometimes you didn't have time to wait.
Yeah, I support everything you said, of course, because I think that us choosing what works best for us individually is what we must do. And taking action, I think, is something that is necessary. But for me, that's a personal choice where you're going to go with that.
Right.
We received a YouTube question from Jim. Are there any in-person Grief Beyond Belief groups or meetings, or is there a desire to develop them or more of them? What other similar in-person secular grief support groups can you direct us to? And he mentions that Compassionate Friends has a Brevard area group that he mentions attending.
So that is a great question. And I'm glad you brought up Compassionate Friends, because I think it, there's been a kind of full circle thing with Compassionate Friends, where one of the members of Grief Beyond Belief, Peggy Johnson, now speaks at every yearly conference of Compassionate Friends about secular grief support. And they actually have a subgroup of Compassionate Friends that secular support. And so it, Compassionate Friends was such a um, inspiration for me. And so I feel really good that then Grief Beyond Belief really inspired them to be able to provide grief support for non-believers. In terms of in-person groups, so I, when it's possible, when it was possible, and when it will be possible in the future, I do grief support workshops pretty much anywhere anyone will fly me to. And what I often do is I'll go and I'll do a talk, and then I will provide a grief support workshop. But obviously, I can't be everywhere and I can't be all the time. And so a few years ago, when organizations started saying to me, and these was usually secular organizations, we'd like to be able to provide support for grief support for our members. Having been asked that question a lot, I wrote a handbook called the Secular Grief Support Handbook. And I am happy to mail the PDF to anyone. It's just 60 pages. But it does include both, how to do grief support events, how to do an ongoing group, but also things like how to provide support if there's, one or a few people in your secular community who are grieving. And so I am anyone anywhere in the world who is, interested in doing this work and making a group happen where they are, I am happy to provide them both, with a copy of the book and with, any consulting and any questions they have about it. I wish there were more in-person secular grief support groups than there are. And one of the things that I think is hardest is that the places where it's most needed often have the least capacity. Um, and, I think the thing of having an online group, it actually, in some ways, um, makes it easier to bring more people together if you're meeting through Zoom. But nothing's like sitting in a room with other people. And so I really hope that secular organizations like this one, and, like there are all over the country, will start to figure out how to do that kind of work in their own communities. Because it could be as simple as every month, having a open grief support group that people can come to, that once a month meeting. And that's the sort of thing the handbook's really there to help people start.
Okay. I mean, I'm just, so if a group wanted to do this, they should reach out to you. Should they email you or?
Yeah. Let me actually just put my info in the chat. Here it is. And
while you're thinking,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry. No, I was going to say, I mean, one of the questions that also came up with it, that was asked was, we have humanist celebrants in the area who have experience with weddings. but they're really hesitating about anything to do with end of life funerals and ceremonial things related to that. So do you have information in this PDF on secular memorials, and would that be where they should start?
Actually, one of the links I just put in chat is very helpful for that. So, a couple years after I started Grief Beyond Belief, it was clear that we really needed an independent website as well. It has a blog, but the blogging is like a couple times a year. Um, the primary part of it that's really useful at griefbeyondbelief.org is what's called the Secular Grief Library. It is hundreds of links to writing and video and audio uh, about secular grief, and some of it is just like articles that I've vetted and made sure don't have anything about God or heaven or anything, any kind of afterlife. Um, but some of it is people's personal stories. And there's a number of items in the category in the library called funerals about secular funerals. The other thing is that there's a section of the website that is specifically secular officiants. There aren't a ton of them. I'm always hoping, more people will contact me and let me know that they're available to provide that kind of service, um, because it's so obviously needed. But in the meantime, the section on funerals actually does have a substantial number of suggestions for secular funerals and memorials. Um, and it's something that's on my mind a lot. I've officiated a couple of memorials myself, and you know, I actually find it incredibly rewarding. I understand that being a humanist celebrant, like weddings are more fun. Like everyone's having fun and it's the happiest day of their life and blah blah blah. But funerals and memorials are incredibly important, and I find being a funeral officiant to be just deeply rewarding, to be able to help people with that process of kind of celebrating someone's life and balancing that celebration of life with the acknowledgement of the loss.
Yes, I definitely can see that. What about dealing with, because earlier in the talk you talked about children and having that conversation with children about death and the cycle of life, so to speak. Do you have any thoughts on how we talk to our children about this as well?
Absolutely. First of all, before I forget it, there is a book called Parenting Beyond Belief. Dale McGowan, and there is a second edition of it came out a few years ago, and I wrote the chapter in it about supporting grieving children. And I didn't just write it from my own knowledge. I basically asked the parents in the Grief Beyond Belief group on Facebook what their advice was and what had helped and hadn't helped. And that just, I find, I was so grateful for everything that they contributed about how they supported their kids through loss. In terms of my own advice, one thing is just people, often even people who themselves don't actually believe in an afterlife, will, you know, try to kind of sugarcoat death for children or make up, they'll say things like, oh, well, she went to sleep, um, or she went away. And it turns out that that kind of sort of, soft pedaling loss doesn't actually help kids. For one thing, Some of the things you say, you don't quite realize it, but you're scaring the heck out of kids. There are kids who, are told that their grandmother went to sleep and didn't wake up. And they, spend the next year scared of going to sleep themselves. So, you can actually, when you think you're being kind, you can actually kind of frighten kids accidentally. Um, and kids, what you really want to do is just kind of give them all the truth that you can. Um, without, you don't need to give them details, but you need to tell them the facts about death, and that death means that the person is gone and that it's permanent. And that's important for kids to understand, and helps them in the long run. The other thing is helping them find ways to keep their loved one kind of alive in their heart. That idea of the ripple effect for children can really be comforting if you, you know, help the child identify things that they shared with the person they're grieving for, and how they can keep those things in their life. Whether it, things like, remember how grandma used to make her, birthday cakes for you. Let's make the cake using her recipe together. Remember how your auntie taught you, how to build a campfire. Let's talk about your auntie while we build the campfire today. Um, those, kind of comforting ideas about how to keep a child, keep a child's loved one in their life and in their mind. And then even encouraging the child, like, you know, do you want to teach your younger sister didn't get to know your auntie? Do you want to teach her how to make the campfire your auntie did, the way your auntie did? And so really these same ideas that are comforting to us can really be comforting to children. But the thing I really recommend is just not lying to them. It doesn't go well and it doesn't help.
I completely agree. Yeah. My son's grandfather died when he was 5, and I think we were very honest about it, and I think it was, you go through the process of grieving, but I think it's much more clear. At least that's my perspective of it as a secular humanist, that it's much more clear in everyone's mind when we have that type of transparency with them.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's also a section in the library that has some articles and blogs and such about how to support kids.
It's wonderful. We are at 4 o'clock. I have a couple more questions, but for anyone who's watching the clock, I just want to give you a heads up on the time that we've now hit an hour, and we're going to go through a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. One question that came up was, what about the loss of friends or family due to changing religious beliefs, which is like a death? So if you end up not having a relationship with your family anymore because you're no longer in their faith tradition.
So I think the first step is just acknowledging that's a kind of grief as well. Grief is really, to my mind, the intersection of love and loss. You don't grieve people you didn't love, um, but any time that you've experienced the loss of people you loved, um, that is a kind of grief. And I think some of the answer is just figuring out how to build chosen family, which is part of what I think that these, secular communities do, are so helpful for. Um, and people, I mean, I've talked to people who've left a lot of different faiths, and it's, really noticeable some of the things they miss. Like you hear over and over, like, I miss the music. So, like, finding a way to, whether it's like you join an a cappella group because you loved singing in church and you're not in the choir anymore. Um, I loved the being able to knowing I was going to see people every week. I mean, there's also, the way church and, religious communities do provide support for their grieving members. And, I think that the more that groups like the one you've started, exist and provide those community supports, the easier that transition is. One of the ways I've heard this described that I think is really, it's like you're offering a safe and soft landing spot. It's not that you can, make the pain of losing faith and losing a faith community go away. It's that you're offering a safe space to land.
We try. It's a challenge. The last question, which is again dealing with celebrants, and we actually have a lot of celebrants here
That's great.
in Central Florida. We've encouraged the Humanist Society to come and work to develop celebrants in the area. But when dealing with ceremonial, secular memorials, what do you do about having that memorial where you have family members who are coming who are religious, the people who are organizing it don't want that at all? How do you respect both sides of the aisle, so to speak?
It's such a good question. Like I said, I officiated a memorial a couple months ago for someone who had died of AIDS, who all of us had known for the last few decades. Um, and there were people of all different beliefs. There were a whole lot of atheists, but there are also, his Christian brother and, you know, lots of people with various, like, kind of spiritual beliefs. And, you know, I think it's a challenge, but I think as long as everyone's respecting each other's belief, it works. So, like, he had himself had become a Zen Buddhist, and we did have someone speak about, his Buddhism at the memorial. And, we had other people who talked about prayer. And, I don't think it's has to be a problem as long as there's this mutual respect. The problem comes when there's these assumptions that everyone's grieving in the same way. Um, and also obviously, you see some. It's hard for me when I go to a funeral of someone who everyone else who's grieving is of a particular religion. Um, but I honestly think that the mutual respect and non-assumptions um, make it possible for everyone to grieve together.
I agree. I actually had someone in our community about a month ago contact me with almost the opposite problem, which was their adult child had died, and they were the ex spouse was organizing the memorial and was very, very religious. And the man who passed was part of the LGBTQ community, and they were going to be potentially, having something that didn't reflect who he had been in his life. And the father was extremely hurt about this, as one would expect. And it's how do you go and communicate to the other loved ones when they are organizing this in another location that what you're doing you feel is disrespectful?
Right.
This is such an emotionally charged
Yeah.
situation, and it unfortunately I'm not always sure that both sides are listening, if you know what I mean.
I think that that's true. And for me, one of the things as the officiant at this memorial that really worked was when I was able to acknowledge that something wasn't in my wheelhouse. So being able to say, like, I'm not going to be able to do the piece of this that's about honoring, this particular belief, or because it's not my wheelhouse. So who can we bring into this, who can we bring into creating this ritual so that, that is both present and supported, but also it's not coming from someone who's ignorant about it. Um,
Right. Yeah. That it's all, yes, it's very emotionally charged and difficult, but having open communication and hopefully finding a way so that all parties can have a voice seems to be the best solution. Okay.
And what's funny is that the things that are comforting to people who are secular tend to also be comforting to people who are religious, which is not true in the opposite direction. The idea that you can celebrate what someone taught you or the impact they had on your life is comforting to everyone. And there's a lot of things that, I mean, you know, I have yet to meet a parent of any belief who liked being told that their child was in a better place. Like, even if you believe in heaven, being told that there's a better place for your child than your arms is not comforting. And so it is interesting that, as was pointed out by David, that, like, you know, the secular approach, it tends to be comforting for most people.
Yes, it does. I think we've shown that with our invocations locally. We've had a big invocation process locally where we've been going into local governments,
Oh, that's great.
and we've been hopefully breaking down the stereotype in some people's minds and showing that we can really open meetings with a warm, inclusive message. And I would say, yes, secular is definitely going to include everyone. I want to say thank you so much for coming. This is such an important conversation. We really appreciate that you've taken the time to be with us. I know for myself, you are setting me on a path. I'm going to go do more research to see what more we can offer locally with this. It's been it's felt challenging, but listening to you makes me feel like it's not impossible. So we should work towards this. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Before everyone else goes, please give me a minute to mention some upcoming events. Next month, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to be back on Zoom with Dr. Dan Batchelder, NASA contractor, for his talk entitled UFOs Maybe, Aliens Probably Not. That is September 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern, right here on Zoom. I will say that Dr. Batchelder is an incredible presenter. We've had him before, and not only is he entertaining, but he will give you some great information as well. Again, to find out how to join us on Meetup, go to meetup.com/CFL Freethought. If you want upcoming activity, event emails, sign up at tinyurl.com/CFFC newsletter. And if you need help connecting with anything you heard today, anything else that we can possibly help with, just reach out and let us know. The email for the organization is info@cflfreethought.org. And with that, we'll let you get back to your weekend, and we'll see you very soon, hopefully. Thank you.